Hello and welcome to the Good Society Forum. My name is Emma Skye and I'm Director of Yale World Fellows and co-host of the Good Society Forum, which is a community of change makers around the world with a common quest to build the good society. My co-host is Nizam Uddin of the Prince's Trust and a 2019 Yale World Fellow. Niz.
Thank you, Emma. Hello, everybody, and you are very welcome to our webinar today, our Good Society Forum webinar. By being a member of our webinar today, you are part of our community of a Good Society Forum. We have a great presence online. We would love for you to join us. We are on Twitter at Good Soc Forum. We're on LinkedIn. We are also on Facebook. My colleague Tiffany will share on our chat function how you can get involved. Now, I know many people have been involved over Zoom, lots of different ways in which you can engage with webinars. Today's webinar will be one where you can engage with us through the chat function. It's how our Good Society Forum webinars are currently conducted. So we would love for you to engage with us. We know we have an incredible topic today with some brilliant speakers. People from all over the world will be joining us, as we've become very accustomed to. So the first thing we would love to do is to get a sense from those of you who are joining us today, where in the world are you? So if you wouldn't mind just looking at your chat function and typing in your city. What city are you currently in and where are you taking part from? Loads of people have already started messaging. Thank you so much. So Emma, feel free to join. I think it's going to be an interesting one today. So we have Azim from Kyrgyzstan. Thank you very much. Michelle Rentner from Brussels, DJ from Brussels. We have Leila Vasquez from Mexico City, Andrea from Hungary, Bill from the Peak District in the United Kingdom. We have Maria from Dubai. We have Sakar from Al Ain in the UAE, Alonso from Philadelphia, Yara from Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, Fatma from Sharjah. You are very welcome. Alex Munoz, a fellow 2019 World Fellow from Santiago in Chile. Thank you for joining us. Ali, thank you again for joining us. We know you're from Vienna via Erbil. Shama from Abu Dhabi. Wonderful to have a good Emirati presence with us. We have Faris from Dubai.
Myrna Ayad from Dubai as well.
Oh, fantastic. I'm still getting through, so I'm sure I'll get there. Arman from Banbury, North Oxfordshire. Thank you so much. Ali from Muscat in Oman, thank you. We have Leonardo from Argentina, who's currently in Cambridge. Pradeep, thank you, from India. Goodness, so I mean, we've got people from all over the world. We have Shahde from San Diego in California. So I think we're doing fairly well for the different time zones. And I think I'm gonna miss some people. George from Lebanon, Jacqueline from Luxembourg, Elizabeth from Doha. Phenomenal. Thank you all so much for joining us. Charlotte from Sweden. I think, and Bilur, thank you again from joining us from Istanbul in Turkey. This by far is our most diverse range of people that we've had. Thank you so much for joining us. So let us get straight to it. Emma, what are we talking about today?
Well, also Her Excellency Noura El-Kabi, the Minister of Culture from the UAE, and we've got from Tunisia, Samir Melki. So,
Wonderful.
a wonderful audience. Now, art and culture has an intrinsic value. It enriches individual lives. As individuals, we may enjoy visits to libraries, museums, theatres, and galleries, or reading a good book, or listening to a great song. But does arts and culture have a societal value? Does it contribute to social cohesion, to education, to our economy? Can it help build compassion, to increase understanding of the other, to promote our common humanity? And if it can and does contribute to the good society, should it be publicly funded? So today we're joined by three wonderful people from the Middle East to discuss, does art matter and does culture have a value? Now our first guest is Sultan Sooud al-Qassemi, who is an Emirati columnist and researcher and founder of Barjeel Art Gallery. Sultan is also a professor in the US. I won't name the university where he teaches politics of modern Middle Eastern art. And he was very active during the Arab Spring, with his tweets becoming a major news source. And he is a 2018 Yale World Fellow. Sultan.
Thank you so much, Emma. Thank you so much, Nizam. Without further ado, allow me please to share my screen and I will begin my presentation. The question we were asked to contemplate today is whether art can contribute to a good society. There is no question that art holds an intrinsic value to the economy. Think of how London's West End contributes 11 billion pounds in sales and production, as well as 2 billion pounds in tax revenues annually for the British economy, the equivalent of 3% of the entire country's GDP, and that is one district in one city. The same can be said about museums and cultural spaces in New York City, in Cairo, in Mexico City. But does it lead to a better society? The short answer is that it can, but not always. Remember how art was employed by the fascist regimes in Nazi Germany and Mussolini to vilify individuals and attempt to re-engineer society to their liking. In the Arab world, throughout the 20th century, art has played an instrumental role in the formation of national identities, for better and for worse. In the late 1920s, Egyptian sculptor Mahmoud Mukhtar was commissioned to create a monument that he called the Renaissance of Egypt, also known as Egypt's Awakening. The modern monument depicted a woman, the symbol of a nation, much like New York's Statue of Liberty, resting her hand on a sphinx while lifting her veil, thereby symbolizing both modernity and rootedness in Egyptian pharaonic heritage. Why was that important to Egypt then? Egypt as a multicultural society that included different ethnic groups from Muslims and Christians, Jews and Baha'is, Greeks, as well as other Europeans, each of which had their own rich cultural heritage. But for a public monument though, perhaps the first such commission that did not portray a national leader, Mukhtar sought to depict a unifying symbol that all communities would relate to and be proud of, that of Egypt's pharaonic past. That the adjoining figure was a woman added a further dimension to that sculpture. Mukhtar's modern monument went on to become one of Egypt's most recognizable monuments, as recognizable perhaps as the 3,000-year-old statue of King Ramses II. It was featured in currencies, in postage stamps, in movies, posters, books, even medicine packaging. It has transcended the various communities and offered Egyptians a unified sense of identity. Going into the 1960s, we see art being used by artists as a tool to portray solidarity with causes around the world, from South Africa to Vietnam, from Palestine all the way to African-American rights, as these two posters portray. On the other hand, however, is Saddam Hussein's 40 meters high victory arch in Baghdad, consisting of two crossed swords, while the hands holding them were molded from the late dictator's own arms. The victory arch was commissioned in the 1980s by Saddam as a symbol of his so-called victory over Iran, although the war was still at its very height. Costly, displeasing to the eye, and divisive. That piece of propaganda was described by Iraqi scholar Kan'an Makkiya as kitsch totalitarian art, and still stands today as a symbol of Saddam's era. Does it contribute to a good society? Debatable. In Egypt, following the 2011 uprising, as state media started turning their attention to other issues, young activists through their spray cans depicted faces of martyrs of the revolution in the streets of Cairo, thereby keeping up the pressure for accountability and serving as a poignant reminder of the demands of the protesters. These works would not have had the same value had they been shown in private museums and closed galleries as they did in the public sphere. Furthermore, when protesters felt that the Egyptian Museum was under threat, they formed a human chain to protect it. This can only happen when individuals and citizens feel a sense of affinity to their culture. Going closer to this current day in 2019, at the peak of the anti-government protest in Sudan, As a new generation rose up against the 30-year-old dictatorship of Omar Bashir, protesters armed with chants and smartphones took to the streets. Lana Haroun snapped a photo of an architectural engineering student named Ala Salah standing atop a car in a white Sudanese thobe, leading crowds chanting. That image, which turned into numerous artworks, not only synergized the protesters, it also gave the world a recognizable symbol to identify with. Sudan's protest had a name and a face, and we all know, especially today, how important that can be. Going back to our question today, does art contribute to a good society? Yes, it can, with conditions. Art, architecture, literature, music, and poetry are some of the elements that define us as human beings. There's a word for them in academia, the humanities. Without these elements, the joie de vivre, the delight of life, would be largely missing. Life would be more ordinary and, dare I say, less exciting. If we didn't have art and poetry, we'd probably have to invent them all over again. Art, after all, is the highest form of human expression. However, in order to contribute to a good society, art must be accessible. Art must be free. Art must belong to the people and not the government. Art must be fair. Art mustn't belong to an elite. To contribute to a good society, art must reflect the best of human beings, but also document the worst of us. Can art lead to a good society? Yes, it can, with conditions. Thank you.
What a start, Sultan. Thank you so much. That was fantastic and an absolute inspiration. I loved how you connected the 60s through to the modern day. So we will now go on to our next speaker, and I'm delighted to introduce now Myrna Ayad, an arts consultant, cultural strategist, and editor. Born in Beirut, she has spent almost 40 years in the UAE. She is the former director of Art Dubai and former editor of Canvas, a leading magazine for art and culture from the Middle East. So Myrna, I hope you are there and joining us hopefully in a second. Wonderful. We very much look forward to hearing from you. Over to you.
Thank you, Nizam. Thank you, Emma, and thank you, Sultan, for such a riveting opening. I'm not going back to the 60s. I'm just going to go back to the 80s. My contribution to this conversation is going to hit more on the emotive and intellectual aspects of the necessity of art in society. And I'm going to start with myself as the example. I have lived in Dubai for 38 years. I'm 42. I came here from Lebanon, where I'm originally from, and it is because of art that I was able to understand who I am and what is my history and what is my background. Growing up in such a multicultural atmosphere in the UAE, where I had friends from literally everywhere, I had such privileged access to all these different cultures, but I still didn't know what I was and who I was. So 38 years later, am I Lebanese? I'm more comfortable saying that I am from the Middle East, even though that is also a contested term. I had the privilege of joining a magazine called Canvas, which focuses on visual art from the Middle East. And I wanted to give a small example about how art can teach tolerance. It was the first time that Canvas magazine participates in Art Basel. This is the mid-2000s, so it was a very big deal. We were the first Middle Eastern organization to take part. And the whole team flew out there and set up the booth. And the night before the vernissage, which is, you know, quite a heated day, I noticed on my way out that there was a booth with a series of beautiful Rothkos, but in the center, there was a pile of garbage with shards of glass, Kit Kat wrappers, and a broomstick. And I felt so bad that they were not ready for the morning. And I walked into the booth and I picked up the broom and I started to sweep the floor, only to realize later that I had damaged an artwork. The experience never left me to this day, and art taught me in more ways than one not to judge, not to assume things, and to dig deeper. While I was at school, we studied about the development of the Aswan Dam and Nasser's Arab nationalism and how wonderful this building of the dam was to Egypt. But it was only through the works of feminist, modernist artists Tahiyya Halim and Gazbia Sirri and Inji Aflatun that I realized this dam was a disaster for the people actually living on the Nile Delta, that they had uprooted, these people who had been living there for hundreds of years because of the building of this dam. Another example that I came to know through art is, although I am originally Lebanese, I had no idea that Lebanon planned to join the space race in the 1960s. But I found out about this through art that was produced by a Lebanese couple called Joanna Hajitouma and Khalil Ujreish. So art started to build, not just my identity, but also my history. There is fundamental aspects of Middle Eastern history that I had no idea about. Today, I am a mother, and I find it such a duty for me to make sure that my daughter knows where she's from and just how great, where she's from is. I fundamentally believe that art is a civic duty. We should all defend it, whether that is literature, dance, publications, visual art, performance. We have to defend this, because how will I know you if I don't know what is your creative expression? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Myrna. Now, our third speaker is Salvo Rocket, who's a Lebanese art expert, a gallery owner, and curator. And he is also a great cook, as I can testify, and also an excellent moped driver. And he is a 2006 Yale World Fellow. Salvo, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Emma. Fantastic. I'm so happy to see that each one of us was tackling a little bit the subject matter in a different way. So I am going also to tackle it in a different angle. I truly believe that art is a very, very powerful tool for the betterment of societies. The reason is, according to French philosopher Jean-François Lyotard, in his seminal book, The Postmodern Condition, change in contemporary societies can happen basically through three vectors. The first one is religion. So imagine, for instance, the Pope decides to accept homosexual marriages in the church. It will happen. So change can happen through religion, but it is very difficult. It's very rare that it happens. The second vector is politics. Change can also happen through politics. If President Lincoln decides to abolish slavery, it's abolished. If President Bourguiba decides that women in Tunisia should not be veiled, women will not be veiled anymore. A more recent example, if Prince Mohammed bin Salman decides that women can drive in Saudi Arabia, they will be able to drive. But unfortunately, also change through politics requires an exceptional statement, which is also rare to happen. So the third vector, which is very important for me, is art, because an artist in the isolation of his atelier, with very minimal means, sometimes a white canvas and some paint, can circumvent taboos and censorships in order to create an artwork that will create a snowball effect. So it will affect 10 people, the 10 people will relay it to 100 and then 1,000. And it's not utopian what I'm saying. I'm going to give an example. For instance, the late filmmaker Jocelyn Saab made this movie called Dunya, which is about the female genital mutilation, FGM. which was very spread in Egypt. And because of this film, she was vilified, the film was banned, she lost all her money, but it created a buzz to the extent where the Azhar University, which is the most important theological university in Islam, had to answer that no, she was not attacking Islam, and that female circumcision is anti-Islamic. So one person, very little woman, Christian, managed somehow to save the lives of millions of females in the Middle East, allowing them to reappropriate their bodies and enjoy their sexual lives. Another quick example, Mahmoud Ubaidi, with his project called Fair Skies, which tackled the issue of racial profiling in homeland security and immigration in the US, but where they were using this term racial profiling against male Arabs between the age of 15 and 40. When the American ambassador in Abu Dhabi saw the project, it created such a buzz that eventually we discovered 6 months later that they've changed the word from racial profiling to history profiling. So actually, yes, art can create change, and of course it takes many forms, but art that I'm interested in is those artists who have this really unbelievable engagement, be it political, social, anthropological, or even aesthetic, very simply. To give some examples, everything can be seen today on Google, but let's say in the political engagement, I would like to mention artists like Shinan Basho, who dedicated her life to the issues of immigration and displacement, Tahrir Darhous, who opened our eyes to the increased monitoring and the question of privacy in our daily life, Abdelrahman Qatanani, who shed light on the refugees' conditions, Serwan Baran on the humiliation and despair that is growing in the Middle East because of the excess militarization, Katia Trabulsi, who in the era of rising wars and rising nationalism and Brexiting, made all her big projects on multiculturalism and the importance of diversity of human cultures. I mean, I can go on and go on in politics, but I would like to mention those also who are very engaged in the questions of social engagement, like Shazza Sharafuddin, who dedicated her life to fight phobias, defending transsexual transvestites in the Lebanese community, racism, by doing her very fantastic project called Maydam, which shed light on racism against domestic helpers in Beirut. Nasser Hussein, who tackled the issue of solitude that is felt by immigrants who leave their homeland without really having a new homeland and living somehow in limbo. I mean, there are so many examples. Samir Sayegh, who is bringing Arabic calligraphy, this old art into a universal form. And to quickly finish with Hadisi, the $0 project, which was very critical about the relationship of art and money. And I'm using this example in order to talk about this question of public funding of art institutions. In fact, this was the case, Emma, public funding of museums and art institutions till the era of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. They dried up the money for this institution, which led to the privatizing of culture, which led to the over-commodification of art and the control of money, the excess control of money in our societies today. All this that has led to the losing of the real value of art, which for me is aesthetic, because according to Kant and the Kantian theory, art brings an additional value different than morality and reason. It's not only enjoyable like wine, like jewelry, like cars. it is beautiful. Hence, we have to remember that the aesthetic value should remain on top of economic value. For me, this is important. This is what makes art a peculiar kind of a product. With all these aberrations happening today, we need to remember that art is a very fantastic expression of change in societies, and we have to keep this value of art and aesthetics on top of other economic values that are important but less important than this subject matter. Thank you.
Saleh, thank you so much. And I'm going to invite Myrna and Sultan now back so that we can engage in a conversation with our audience. We've had questions coming through. We've had some brilliant engagement already. This has been, and you know, I hope I'm not being biased here, from all of our webinars, one of the richest presentations we've had so far, actually. You've covered the institutional, the political, the personal from Myrna, and the aesthetic and the beauty. It's reflective of what we're trying to cover today, art and the good society. So I want to just make a note and note the comments we've already had, just to commend the presentation so far from, I mean, we've had some, Salim just said he was looking for inspiration this morning, and he can always count on Ustad Sultan to offer that. So thank you, and so many others. And Maria, I think this is an important point. Modern art, which teaches not to assume things and dig deeper. Thank you. Keep them coming, keep the conversation going. So I have a question that I would like to offer to start conversations. And Myrna, I'm going to come to you if that's okay, which is, Picasso famously said, every child is an artist. The problem is how to remain an artist once we grow up. How have you, and you talked about the impact that art has had on you, how have you personally ensured that you yourself have remained an artist? And how are you helping your children, who you also mentioned, to remain artists? You're just on mute, just 1 second, hopefully we'll, there we go.
Got it. Thank you, Nizam. Well, because I'm a mom, I'm time challenged. So if I have an art fair or an art gallery to go to, I take her with me because I believe in seeing. And whether she likes it or she doesn't like it, I want to know. So I ask her. Her opinion. I think seeing is extremely important. You need to keep training your eye. You need to see as much as possible. There's no limit to seeing. I also think reading is extremely important too. There's a lot out there. And I also think talking is very important. I love having conversations with actually two of my professors on this panel today. You know, I have had endless conversations with Sultan and Saleh that have been such a privilege. And I think we should keep talking and keep learning to keep the conversation going.
Thank you. And Saleh, if I may ask you the same question in a slightly different way, which is, how do you ensure institutionally younger generations are able to keep and retain artistry within themselves? Because I know you have a gallery and you work across institutions. How is that? How do we do that in a successful way? How have you seen it being done?
Well, actually, it's a decision when institutions want really to reach out for youngsters. You have to make sure about the location, about the accessibility. I mean, when I decided to open my new gallery, I had a lot of places to go around, which were much cheaper. But for me, it was absolutely that I don't want to be in an area that is not accessible by public transportation. And that, for instance, poorer strata of the society, students of the Lebanese University, for instance, cannot access. You need to have the accessibility easy because these are, it's for them that we are doing all what we are doing. I consider myself, like Sultan and many others, we are custodians of a cultural identity that we would like to relay to the future generations, for them to enjoy this wealth of diversity and multiplicity and of human cultures.
Sarah, thank you. And Sultan, I'll come to you, and I'd love to hear your response to how you've retained art within your own DNA in your daily life. Mark Gonzalez, who you know, has sent in a separate message to me. One of the best definitions of art is the creative expression of human existence. This is why neurologically we understand that bad things happen when we don't express ourselves, be it emotionally, intellectually, and creatively. Why then are we at such a base level of understanding of the necessary of art in society, that it's not only good, it's necessary to the point that if we don't, it's harmful?
Thank you. I think there is a misperception or misunderstanding that art is for the elite, that art is for a specific group of people. And I think that society and the elites within society have perpetuated this myth. And I think it is time to make sure that art is accessible. As I said, art is fair, art is available. We have to make sure that museums, I think in the UK now, many museums are becoming free. In the US, there's also this trend. And so this is very, very important that we have to make sure that art is available for the public. A lot of people, Nizam, even in the UAE or in the West, they sort of hesitate to go to museums and galleries because they feel like they wouldn't fit in, because they feel that this place is reserved for a certain strata of individuals. That should not be the case. We should make sure that everyone is welcome. How do you make sure everyone's welcome? Everybody must be reflected there. So if you want to include the Asian community, there must be art by Asians in these museums. If you want to include, if you want to bring in the African community, the Arab community, the Latin American community, their work must be reflected. For many years, it used to be, with all due respect, a certain segment and a certain gender whose art dominated museums. And that is probably what perpetuated somewhat the lack of accessibility to museums, although we're seeing a large change in the UAE. I think Emma mentioned that the Minister of Culture in the UAE is currently on in this chat. It's a woman, so it's very important that we include leading figures also from the female gender. These are major changes that are happening not only in the West but also in the Middle East.
So, and on that, we've had a question here from Mojgan, who clearly agrees with you, and I think your leadership in Sharjah in particular. How have institutions and museums in the UAE specifically, in your opinion, what steps have they practically taken? And I think you've alluded to a few, and it'd be great maybe for when we do launch this webinar elsewhere, what steps have you taken to make it so accessible that it has been a success? Is there anything else that you would add to UK institutions in Paris that hold such incredible art and treasures for them to learn from the UAE?
It's very difficult for me to speak when I have Myrna and Saleh here as well. So much more.
I'll go to them next. But
I would say that what we've done in the UAE, I think, is a model that is rare in the region anywhere. We have art by all the various communities. I'll give you an example. When the UAE went to Venice for the first time in 2009, we represented not only national artists, but we also took with us non-citizens. So artists who are Asian and who are Middle Eastern and who are not citizens of the UAE. And that is a great example of how inclusive the UAE is of a country. I don't want to sound like I'm advertising for the UAE, but it's a model that I know. And I'm hoping that this model is reflected in other countries as well, that we can make art as inclusive as possible. In our show, for example, we make sure that we have art by Jews from the Middle East, by Christians, by different denominations. I don't want to name any because there's so many. So we want to make sure that different religions, different ethnic groups, our show is gender balanced. We have a show that's 50-50, male, female, might be the only one in the world. I want to stop speaking because I don't want to advertise for ourselves, but I think you're seeing more happening in the Middle East than in some parts of the West.
Sultan, if you won't celebrate you, we will, because we know how visionary and open you have been with your work. And so if I can come to Myrna and Saleh, and Myrna, I'll come to you first. And we're seeing comments here about the importance of inclusion, about the importance of governance and actually curating the arts. What steps have you seen in your time in the industry that has effectively allowed art to be open to many more people and not just the preserve of the elite?
You know, Nizam, when I was director of Art Dubai, A lot of the questions that I would get from the press was about being a woman. And being a woman in the Gulf, and being a woman in a senior position in an art institution. And I kept saying, and I will keep saying to this day, two things. First of all, it's a non-issue. Okay, we don't have this gender issue. And number two is I actually come from a very long line of female predecessors. We're talking from Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Egypt. I mean, from somebody like Janine Erbez in Beirut, to Princess Wajdan in Jordan, to Sheikha Salama in Abu Dhabi, to Princess Jawahir in Saudi. You're talking, these are women who activated their local art scenes from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you know, in their respective countries. And they still do that today. So I'm not new. I'm actually a descendant. And as Sultan mentioned, we have a wonderful female Minister of Culture, Noura Al-Kaabi. And you know, we have a lot of women leaders actually in the UAE. We have Vilma Jurkut running Al Sirkal Avenue. We have Antonia Carver, my predecessor, who's running the Jameel Art Center. Sheikha al-Qassemi in Sharjah, Sheikha Salama, and Sheikha Maryam in Abu Dhabi. So it's a women-dominated art scene, if I can say so. So we have this inclusive aspect in our scene. I think the other thing that the UAE differs greatly with compared to other art scenes is if I go to Lebanon, I'm going to see Lebanese art. If I go to Iran, I will see Iranian art. But if I come to the UAE, I'm going to see the world. I see everything here. Because of the leadership, because of, you know, the nature of the galleries, because of the, you know, the many initiatives that are being promoted here. So I see everything, and we don't, this inclusive thing is not a thing. And one more thing about Sultan. Sultan actually pioneered the other day with the Barjeel coloring book, which my daughter is now coloring in. I know this is not a new idea, but it's the first time that she colors Arab artworks. And that's a major thing.
Fantastic, thank you. And Saleh, in a very similar vein, and I know much has been answered, Maria has asked a specific question around digitalization and how can we use the power of technology and digital technology to ensure future generations are accessing art. Is that something that you've had to grapple with in your work?
Actually, it's weird that yes, of course, I've started to work on the digitalization of the archive of the gallery and all the contents of the gallery pretty much before Corona. And actually, when Corona happened and we had to be confined in our houses, the gallery continued to work fully. Each one remotely from his own home, and we continue to disseminate a lot of information related to art and Corona and the situation, because I think somehow while the physical gallery is extremely important, there is this new element that has been added. I mean, I have access to a lot of people in Beirut. They come to my gallery. It's easy and they come and see. But I've seen now people assisting this webinar from Adelaide in Australia, many other places. So this gives a dimension that is extremely important not to acknowledge. Opening and technology has become definitely part of what we need to develop in our sector.
Thank you, Saleh. And Sultan, I'd love to ask you about technology and your thoughts. Dr. Etim from Nigeria has said there are ongoing protests in different parts of the world, specifically to address racism. As an African, I want to know, how can art be used to address this issue? Can art help people to unlearn racial discrimination? So an easy question for you there.
I think the answer is yes, that racism is something that is not inherent. Racism is something we learn as we grow. Unfortunately, because of some media, unfortunately, because of some leaders, unfortunately, because of some people who I don't want to name, but we can unlearn it. So how can we unlearn it? We can unlearn it by demanding that in America, African-American artists are represented in museums, but also art by women, art by other groups, so Asian Americans, African Americans, Middle Eastern Americans. So yes, we can use art in order to, just like racism was perpetuated by bad people, we can start perpetuating positivity, perpetuating anti-racism, making sure that people of color are represented in museums, and not just as a gesture of goodwill for a couple of months, but made sure that they are integrated into the museum, integrated into the literature, the scholarship. Do we really need another book about a certain artist from Europe? Probably not. But we make sure that there are books written about women artists, about minorities, about African Americans. This is what we need, and in different languages as well.
Sultan, thank you. And Myrna, if I may come to you on a similar point, I'd love to hear your thoughts as to what Sultan has just said in terms of how you address some real deep-rooted issues globally on issues of racial discrimination and other forms of discrimination. Samia from Tunisia has also said, despite the relatively recent globalization of art, in her opinion, most Middle Eastern art is too concerned with geopolitical issues. How can we see that develop in the future?
You know, I still got it a lot when I was the editor of Canvas, and I still get it. There's a misperception that Middle Eastern art is conflict-based. Okay, you know, and we actually launched a series of talks. It was called Gender Wars and Chadors. Is that all there is to Middle Eastern art? And we had conversations in Art Basel Miami, and Frieze London, and Art Basel Basel. And it was annoying. It still is, because that's not what Middle Eastern art is all about. And I completely second everything that Sultan had to say. If we have a problem, like we have a problem right now with racism, the way to combat this is to show art by minorities, is to show art by, you know, I mean, for example, when we were attacked for showing a lot of conflict-based art, the answer to that was to show, for example, modern art, which was not based on conflict, to show other contemporary art. But the fact is, the West sensationalized, you know, conflict. It just became so sexy, it became so attractive, and we were pigeonholed, and that was it. The answer to that is to show the other side. Like Sultan said, do we need another book on Picasso? Do we need another book on a European artist? No. We need more books on minorities, you know. This is what is necessary. We need to know more. We don't need to know more of what we already know. We need to know more of what we don't know.
Thank you, Myrna. And Saleh, I'm going to come to you and ask you a question that I have in relation to what we've just heard, which is we need more diverse commissions from different communities to be in our galleries. But the existing clientele of galleries, because of the way in which art, to an extent, has been preserved to a segment of our society, is a very powerful group to potentially utilize to affect change for the good of society. In any way, have you seen art being utilized in that way, where the clientele that you may have or the demographics that are using art are powerful, can change society? Can we utilize that demographic in a positive way?
Look, just to go back to what Sultan and Myrna have said, in fact, unfortunately, people look at Middle Eastern art basically from the political window, because this is what was basically interesting the curators, the European and Western curators. They were, after September 11, interested in what is this Middle Eastern society that could have created these unfortunate events. That led the fact to make all the other vectors completely into oblivion. That's why I insisted to say some artists are engaged politically, but many others are engaged on a social level, on an aesthetical level, on a critical level. And this is the role of engaged galleries, in the sense that while I know that socially engaged artists could not be an economically interesting project, because people would not like to see domestic helpers being hanged in their salon. But what we do every now and then is to show the society, at least in our community in Beirut, that why is this racism against domestic helpers? If you take a Filipino maid and give her a nice dress and a nice makeup, and you put her in a nice setting, she will look like Marilyn Monroe. And it was in these conditions when another case where we brought the transsexual community in Beirut, and we gave them the platform for once to be able to show themselves they are part of this society. And it was extremely important to normalize the lives of those people who are not included. I mean, and I do believe that art helps in that endeavor. I have known people who, for them, when I invited them to come and see what we have done about this transsexual, transvestites, LGBT community, they were horrified. But then they came and they discovered that those people are as normal as the others, and then art really can play a role in being inclusive to those sidelined communities.
Sada, thank you for the response and for your leadership. And Sultan, I'll come to you and you can actively come back on the Picasso comment. I have a couple of points here. One, which is from David, who said the line between art and propaganda has become increasingly blurry. How can we help art to maintain its integrity and survive the surge of messaging that dominates modern times? And Amal has added to that and asked, how can artists use social commentary better to convey messages through their artworks?
Wow. Okay. Well, art and propaganda has been increasingly blurred for the past century. So think of what happened under Nazi Germany, what happened under the USSR, what happened under Franco, the futurism movement that's a century old. The fact is, and I'm not defending some of this art, but some of them was made by really great artists. So what do we do with that? Do we destroy this work? I am not sure. I wouldn't buy it, but I wouldn't want to see it destroyed. And people are revisiting some of these artworks and making sure that they are preserved and studied the way they should be studied, and not admired for their ideas, but maybe just as a document in order to study history. So art and propaganda have been mixed for a century, and I think they will be with us for another century. And you see it happening even today on social media with people manipulating images. So this is something that will be with us for a long time. I don't know how we can get rid of it. I think some people are trying to, but it is probably impossible. I forgot your second question, Nizam.
Well, the second one was from Amal, which is how can artists use social commentary better to convey messages, both directly and through their artwork?
I think it's also important that artists not only create work, but also speak about their art. So a lot of times, oftentimes, we don't know really if this artist meant this topic or they had this opinion. Maybe artists prefer not to speak, but we have to make sure that if they do choose to speak, that we have to listen to them, document. I think, again, books, interviews, anything we can do, translate, digitize. Salih Barakat was talking about digitization. All this, I think, is important in order for us to understand what we have available and what has happened in the past 100 years.
Thank you, Sultan. And Myrna, Michelle Rentonar from Brussels has asked a question here, which is the Enlightenment made art by individual artists possible. That individualism laid the building stones of the creation of democratic societies. Can art once more be a boost for a second wave of good societies, in your opinion? And what might that look like?
Like the UAE. Yes, I do think so, and I think that you know, I feel like I'm an example. You know, we didn't have museums or galleries when I was growing up here, and thank God I had wonderful parents who are great travelers and made sure to take us everywhere and drag us, you know, painfully to museums. But look at where we are today in such a short amount of time. You know, I think that the future of any society, art community, is tolerance. and it is, you know, the respect for the other, and it is, you know, inclusivity. And I feel that the UAE and, you know, other Gulf nations that are, you know, investing a lot in culture understand this thoroughly. They understand that this is the way to communicate, this is the way to build legacies, and this is the way to leave imprints. It is through culture. It's through cultural diplomacy. So I think if we do more of this, then we have healthy societies, as you mentioned.
Thank you. And Saleh, Andrew has asked a question around making reference to the many pieces of art lost around the world due to conflict and the systemic erasing of cultures in particular that we've seen in parts of West Africa. That's not Andrew's words, those are mine. Is there a way to combine both the losses in the natural world in terms of ecosystem and species due to climate change with the losses in the art world to educate people in how the destruction of both are intertwined? And I'll come to you next, Sultan.
Well, yes, the truth is, I do consider that all what I do in my life is being a custodian of trying to salvage whatever I can of this Levantine identity and culture, which is multi-confessional and multi-ethnic, and that I believe is in danger today because of excessive wars. And there is always, when there is a way, there is a will, there is a way. We have a lot of foundations, very erudite foundations, like in music, Ammar Foundation, what I'm doing, trying to conserve as much of the relics that we can keep for the future generation. But I wanted really to comment on something about what Sultan and Mira have tackled about art and propaganda. In fact, I face this every day when I see the work of an artist. I would like to remind everybody that the topic of the art is only a reason to create art. I mean, Morandi was painting bottles and other people would talk about wars or about racism or what have you. But eventually, if the artist is incapable of transcending whatever subject matter that is obsessing him at the moment into an aesthetic dimension that is atemporal, in which case it goes into another sphere of pertinence that when we look, somebody was mentioning Balla, when you look at the work of Balla today, what you see is how he transcended whatever he wanted back in time into a fantastic, beautiful art.
Thank you. And Sultan, I would love your thoughts on that question by Andrew about lost art and the ecosystem and how they're intertwined and how we can respond to that.
So unfortunately, Andrew, the Middle East is one of the prime examples of lost art. We've seen conflict happen in half a dozen countries. We've seen people looting art, foreign invaders. We've seen art being destroyed. We've seen neglect of art. We've seen, I mean, the Middle East really is the poster child also for, amongst many other things. One of them is also lost and looted and destroyed art. So there are many great initiatives. I think in Lebanon, there's an initiative, I believe in Abu Dhabi, there was an initiative by the Louvre that they signed some agreement with France with the UNESCO in order to salvage and in order to protect these artworks. So we've seen a lot of initiatives happen in the region. And I think this is something that needs to be done in coordination with West Africa, with parts of Asia where there is destruction. What I think one word I want to use here is this confluence, and we have to aggregate our efforts. Just like what's happening in the US, I don't want to change the conversation topic, but you see through the African American rights movement, you see them you see them bringing other rights. So you see them sort of partnering with other groups in which they want to make sure that this message of change is a message that's forceful, is a message that's inclusive, is a message that includes many other factors and many other elements. And so even in the Middle East, we have to make sure that if we want to protect our heritage, we also should think about protecting the climate, the environment, about protecting minorities. So there's many issues that are actually related. Even if they are not artistic, they are related, because when there is poverty, there's a higher chance of war. When there's a higher chance of war, there's a higher chance of destruction of cultural heritage. And so we need to make sure that all these things, economic conditions, impact cultural issues as well.
Sultan, thank you so much. That's an incredibly important point. And thank you so much to everybody who's participating. This is an incredibly rich discussion. We do have limited time, so I am really sorry if we can't get through to everyone's comments or questions. Myrna, if I can come to you with a question from Enoch around how can artists be more aware individually of their own intellectual or political biases? Is there something that they could do? Is there anything that you've seen, especially in a time where we're all being asked to think about our privileges, how we engage with minorities, and we've seen that commentary coming quite loudly from the US across to the rest of the world and the other way around. How can artists do the same?
I remember when the Arab Spring happened, there was actually a term then coined in the media. It was art produced or art inspired by the Arab Spring. And it was littered, you saw it everywhere for a couple of years. And I remember thinking to myself, and this is still my answer, you need to spend time thinking about this. You need to let the idea pickle, let it, ruminate over it again and again. Don't immediately react. Don't immediately create. You need to think about it, let it simmer, and give it some time, and then come back to it and give your opinion. Don't do it on the spot, because your opinion will change. And the Arab Spring started as something, but it ended as something else. So that art that you created was, it was for the first bit of it. It's not reflective of an entire movement or an entire period of time. So my advice is give the thought time. Let it pickle, as I said.
Wonderful, Myrna, thank you. And Saleh, I'd love to hear your thoughts and to advice given to artists about their own reflexivity on this issue. And then there's a question here from, I believe, Alonso, and also there's a question from Mohammed around the funding of the art. So I think we've ascertained here from each of you and the ways in which you've talked about art. It is a vehicle that absolutely can build good societies. What should be the funding structure? Should it be solely private or should it be public? And how do we find that balance?
Ideally, it should be public. It should be public and private, and it depends on each situation. The truth, I believe that people, when you have to raise awareness and consciousness about the importance of art and cultural heritage, in which case money can always be found. I mean, there are always many ways to raise funds if there is interest and there is consciousness about the importance of the preservation of the cultural heritage. But really that requires huge accumulation of knowledge about the cultural heritage. I mean, I'm going to be mentioning a very because of confinement, I found myself confined in a very remote mountain, and I discovered that the peasants in this very remote area still have this tradition of going to the fields and cutting wild herbs, really wild herbs that have absolutely non-pronounceable names, very weird, that we never thought are edible. And by going and talking to these people, I discovered that this is an amazing cuisine. This is like art. It has to be preserved. It's an oral tradition. It's all about awareness. People have to know that, and in these times of globalization, which I believe is a great thing, what makes you different is your specificity, being global, but at the same time being different. And when people will be aware of the wealth of their cultural specificities, they will understand that this is a treasure trove. It's like banking, it's like industry, it's like agriculture. The cultural heritage is a treasure trove that needs to be exploited when people are aware and conscious of its importance.
Sarah, that was beautiful. Thank you very much. So you've just answered the last question that I was going to ask our panel before we have to wrap up, as we have just come up to the hour, which is, during this COVID period in particular, what has given you hope in the power and the transformative power of art? And I mean, I'll go to Myrna first, and Saleh, I'll come to you one last time if you want to add something. Maybe in 15 seconds, Myrna, if there's one thing that you could potentially say that has given you hope.
The need to connect. We need to connect, and the virtual thing is great, but it's not enough. And this virtual thing does zero justice to experiencing art live. I love seeing Sultan, I love seeing Saleh, I love having met you all, don't get me wrong. We can do this every day, I don't mind, but I want to go to a museum, I want to go to a gallery. I have to go.
Thank you. Saleh, anything to add?
Well, this confinement taught me that I always, anyway, I'm a positive man, and I always look at the
You're back.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It taught me to look at the positive side and always look, this is a challenge. How can we get use of it? Lebanon is going through a financial catastrophe. COVID came in order to terminate it. And today I would think that it's a great occasion for us to learn how to deal with this very tough situation by going back to our roots, by what makes us survive. And I learned from this confinement that we can do even better and better by going back to nature, reconciling with ourselves, criticizing our excessive consumption. I mean, so many things. I found it a fantastic occasion to meditate.
Saleh, thank you. And Sultan, last words to you.
I just can't wait to see all the great art that's being created at this time.
Fantastic. Sultan, Saleh, Myrna, thank you so much for your time, for your contributions today, and for your leadership in this space. We look forward to continuing this conversation in a very real way. Emma, over to you.
Thanks, Niz. And thank you, Myrna, Sultan, Saleh, custodians of culture. What an incredibly inspiring conversation we've had. And thank you to the audience. We got up to 200 people listening to this, all sending messages saying that this has just been so inspiring. So thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And please join us at the same time on Wednesday, when we're going to be discussing international cooperation with diplomats from Europe, Latin America, and Africa. So thank you all.
Thank you again. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Bye.